Hi, welcome to the Agent Odyssey. My name is Matt Wyman. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Acario. We provide simulation and monitoring for agents so you can actually get them to production. And production is the topic of the day today. I have Korash Hernandez with me today from TrueAgents, COO and co-founder. And Korash has immense background in analytics, modeling, AI governance, and really brings a whole enterprise perspective of the market that I'm really excited to talk about. Korash, maybe you can tell us a bit about what you're up to at TrueAgents.
Sure. So I'm Korash Hernandez. I founded TrueAgents in 2023. We were recently funded through the Plug and Play Accelerator, and we have our largest enterprise client is a Fortune 100 insurance company. What we do is we provide one-on-one customer communications at scale, aimed primarily at outbound marketing type activities. So outbound for cross-sell, upsell, retention campaigns. We do customer service as well, but that's not really our focus. And we are trying to do all of that and are doing all of that with a primary focus on compliance. And that's what we're going to get into today. We're going to get into today about what we've seen in the AI agentic space over the past couple of years, what's working, what's not working, and what you have to change, both from a process standpoint and also a mindset standpoint, to get agentic workflows all the way into production, which is something that I know is near and dear to your heart, Matt.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I'd love to start in that place, actually, talking a bit about what does it mean to be agentic? What does it mean to have an agent and that carryover from the world of model building and thinking about how you build models and stabilizing models? What jumps out as the differences between the two?
I think that there are sort of foundational pieces that are the same, right? At the end of the day, all of these agents are built on a machine learning framework, and that is the transformer neural network framework. And so there are some elements that are the same, but where you start to get into differences is both traditional modeling and agentic AI, or I'll say maybe the generative part of AI, is really about prediction. It's about predicting what the next best thing to do is or what the next best thing to say is. Where you start to get differences is agentic crosses over from just making a prediction to taking an action. Now we're not just saying, well, here's the next most likely thing to occur. But what do you do with that? How do you take that information and make it actionable? And how do you do so in a way that's intelligent? And that's the big difference, because it's one thing to say, hey, this is how well the model predicts outcome X. And it's another very different thing to say, the model did X, Y, and Z, and are we okay with what it did? And I think that is the big sort of generational leap in terms of how we use analytics. And it's one that's going to cause a lot of angst from certain groups within inside the organization. I'm specifically thinking about third-party risk management organizations, risk organizations, and compliance organizations. Because once you make that leap, you've turned over the keys to the kingdom to a computer that you're not 100% sure you can trust. And I think that's a big part of the problem that people in this space need to think about and solve, is how do you solve the trust component?
Yeah, that's exactly where I want to dig in, because now if we take this to the enterprise, quite a lot of companies are thinking in terms of, and they're talking about what they build in terms of very data science oriented metrics, which is wonderful if you're building models and delivering models. And there's an entire very loud portion of the broader market that is about providing models, and it's appropriate to talk about those metrics. But when you move into agents, as you said, it is a different mentality. It's systemic. You're thinking about a system of these different models interacting together. And now inside the enterprise, how many enterprises do you feel understand the difference between them? And are they ready to receive those benchmarks and to look at those metrics to make judgment calls?
Mostly no.
Yeah.
I think that what we've been seeing in the industry particularly from regulated industries that we deal with, from insurance, financial services, there is still a lack of understanding about how to get your arms around this. Because yes, you can measure how well the model predicts the next token. You can measure perplexity or entropy or MMLU, and all of those are fine and dandy, but they're all very generic. They're all about, well, is the model capable of producing something that's reasonable? But these enterprises aren't deploying a benchmark or an evaluation set. They're deploying a workflow. They're deploying a process that they're going to use to affect their clients. And so it's not enough to say, well, I can measure how well it does. The question is how well is it for the purpose you're using it for? How well does it fit that? And so you need to be very careful and thoughtful about how you put together an evaluation framework around the use case you're deploying, not the model. The model, like, whether you're using, Claude or ChatGPT, or you even homegrown something like that, that's one thing. But if you use it for a purpose that's not really meant for, it kind of doesn't matter how well it predicts the next token. You've got to think about how you're going to evaluate it for the purpose you're using it. And I think this is where a lot of these companies aren't ready. Some of those guidelines and standards are still being written. The NIST documentation came out, like 2-3 months ago?
Yeah.
And it's very generic. You need to have a way to identify data and monitor for drift, and then have a feedback loop to make sure that you're managing all of that. But it's very sparse on specific metrics that you should use. And that's because it's going to be use case dependent. And so I think a lot of these companies are still figuring it out, and the skill sets needed to figure that out are kind of niche still.
They are. We're also seeing there are different parties that are all involved in the same activity. So you have potentially an engineering and product organization that are trying to build an agent of some sort, and they're trying to express to their business partners how well it's going to work, whether it's trustworthy. But then you also have teams outside of engineering that want to buy solutions that are agents, but they still have the same question. Well, XYZ company, can I trust them? And this is something you're running headlong into with TrueAgents. So how are you approaching those business users and having this conversation with them about TrueAgents and its readiness for production?
Yeah, I think you end up with sort of two different conversations, and you've alluded to it already. You've got different groups inside the organization that all have a stake in this. You have the business users who are interested in what it can deliver in terms of end results for them, for their business unit, and the top line metrics that they're getting tracked on. You've got the technical operations teams that are thinking about integration and how do I make sure that data is flowing appropriately, that I'm secure. And then you've got risk management and compliance groups, which are thinking about, well, how do I know that this thing is safe? The safety and soundness of this thing for use inside the business. And so you have to manage all three of those conversations in a rational and systemic way. I'll start with the business side. On the business side, they're really interested in what the results are going to be and how easy it is for them to manage to get those results. And I would say that you need to look at what product you're going to market to them, and you need to manage expectations there. Because I think it's one thing to go in there and say, hey, listen, I'm going to reduce your costs by 20%. Okay. You're going to get a certain level of buy-in for that. It's another thing to go in there and be able to prove you're getting 500% lift in revenue. Those are two enormously different things, and they're dependent on the use case that your product is serving. And you need to understand which of those groups you're in. For me, I'm lucky to be in the latter group. We can show revenue increase in multiples. And so that gets you a lot of buy-in from the business side. And you really need them to go and be a champion to kind of get you through the other two groups. Because those other two groups are very quick and happy to move on and not change anything. They tend to be a little averse, right?
Yeah.
Technical groups, they don't like to have to move things new and things into integration because they have to worry about regression against all the other systems. And compliance and risk management people are just risk averse by nature. And so you need, I think, that first group to help you with the other two groups. And that's something that it really is dependent on your use case. I think for the other two groups, there's a different talk off. And the type of trust they're looking for is different. The business people want, I can trust you to deliver what you say you're going to deliver. The technical people, I can trust you not to break my other systems. And the compliance people, I can trust you not to put me in court where I'm getting sued. And so you have to have a different way that you deal with and manage each of those groups.
Yeah, and a benchmark doesn't really tell anything to any of those groups. It's just it's a raw number, not use case specific. I'm also struck that we're seeing a lot of POCs that, more than POCs, we're seeing agents get to production, but not necessarily stick or get replaced or be superseded. And quite a bit of this has been chalked up to just pace in the larger market. That's just like, oh, there's always a new shiny object and there's always another and another and another. But
Yeah.
I wonder if it's actually something closer to what you're describing, in that if they're only lightly trusted, then they never have a chance to create roots within the enterprise and actually become sticky. And so I'm curious if you're seeing, as you start to have a conversation on the business side, if you see that expand within the organization, and so it can build some trust roots in other parts of the organization, how they're interacting.
Yeah, I think this kind of goes back to it's an age old term in the business, the B2B SaaS world, and it's called land and expand. And the idea is if you can find a use case for which you can provide and prove value to an organization, that gets you your foot in a lot of other doors inside the same organization. And that's what happened with us and our largest client. We went in there as a pilot. We were in a bake-off with a couple of other different solutions. And we were the only AI native solution in the group. And that required a few things to kind of line up. The first thing that had to line up was we had to have a well thought out, well documented, visible compliance framework that went around all of this. Because the first step in getting even into that bake-off was to go to TPRM and go to compliance and go to their newly formed AI governance council, which they still didn't kind of know what they were doing yet because they were so new. They'd only been around for like 3 months. And so we went in there and presented, here is how you can measure AI for safety and compliance. Here's how we do it. Here are the metrics we're going to track. Here is the type of reporting we can provide you. That allowed us to get the approval from that group to even be part of the bake-off. Once we were part of the bake-off, we were then able to prove out to the business side. And they measured our results against the other two. And we were orders of magnitude better in terms of the final engagement metrics with the clients as part of that POC. So on the compliance and governance side, we provided trust with a framework that answered the question about whether it was safe to use for this particular use case. On the business side, we were able to gather trust by showing that we could deliver the results we said we were going to deliver. And on the technical integration side, we're very API driven. It's pretty standard the way that we do things. And we made the very conscious decision early on to never be a rip and replace type of a product, but always be something that could easily be bolted onto existing systems. And so we were able to get trust from all three of those groups. I think anybody who's going to be successful needs to be able to handle each of those three groups, because once you get yourself in the door, guess what happens? You're now an approved vendor inside the organization, and they have 1,000 other use cases that they can then consider you for. And I think managing those three groups effectively is going to be the secret for any agentic system that wants to get into enterprises.
Yeah, but it does feel like it's not exactly land and expand. It's land and trust, then expand.
Yes,
And
that's
and that
perfect.
middle one is what I think a lot of folks are missing. They don't establish the full trust. It's not that they're not being used, but they're being used with a caveat. And the caveat is a risk statement. And I think a lot of the enterprises are doing a little bit of a wait and see. Okay, we'll bring this in. If it has the kind of multiples that we're looking for, then we're willing to put that little star next to it and wait to see how it goes for a time. If there's something better, it's not sticky yet. But once they get over the trust hurdle, then the rest opens up. Then you have the opportunity to reach out to other parts of the organization. And I think that trust wall is different for the business buying agents than it is for the internal teams building.
Yeah.
the internal
I
teams
would agree.
building, I think your earlier statement about um, looking at those metrics and benchmarks, it's a different set of habits.
Mhm.
And we're not yet talking across the enterprise in the same language. Do you think that some of the standards are what bridge that, or is it time? What's going to help bridge this conversation within the enterprise for trust?
I think it's going to have to be. I think it's probably going to be driven out of one of the modeling or analytics groups inside the organization. Because what you have here, it's not necessarily that we don't have the metrics and that they don't exist. It almost feels to me like, in many cases, a translation problem,
Mm,
because you have one set of nomenclature and metrics for a group and another for a different group. So for the group that's actually deploying these models, they may be thinking in terms of business metrics. For the group that's managing it, they may be thinking in terms of how well is the model on more traditional measures of accuracy. And then you have a compliance and risk group, which thinks about it in different terms entirely. And you have to translate across those groups. So this is what I did for most of my career. I had to take traditional sort of statistical and machine learning metrics and then translate it into something that lawyers could understand, because they don't read statistics. Good example was many of the models that we produced there were based off of traditional regression, where you have a specific attribute, and if that attribute goes up by 5, that means a certain thing for the output of the score. When you have that sort of translation, you can say, this is an attribute. If it goes up, that's good. If it goes down, that's bad. That's something that lawyers could evaluate and say, does it make sense that if that goes up, the score should go up? And if that goes down, the score should go down. And being able to translate from the way that we run evals on LLMs and agents into something that lawyers can understand without having to get a degree in machine learning, that is what you have to do. You have to be able to take the evaluations and turn it into something that is digestible by a non-technical audience in a way that speaks to their concerns. I think that's what needs to happen if you're going to have this cross trust across an organization. And that's not easy to do.
no, it's not easy to do. Also, hearing you, it brought to mind systems thinking,
Mhm.
uh, which, I mean, even within engineering, where this is supposed to be one of the core skills, it's still a difficult skill. You have these architects and chief architects who truly are experts at systems thinking, but now that we're seeing agents that can talk to one another show up in large enterprises, and everyone, well, maybe I shouldn't say everyone, but there's definitely a view that in the future we can see more process automation by having agents that are able to reach out to one another. That's going to require a whole new set of concepts, the systems thinking at minimum. And I'm not sure how you translate that to legal. I'm just curious how do you parse these internal agents working with external agents and the decision makers having to look across them? Do they rely more on governance,
Mhm.
like AI governance teams, or do they
Yeah.
start to distribute this knowledge into the system? I guess I'm coming back to the standards question in some ways.
Yeah,
Like, are we going to
it's a
get
good
there?
point. And this reminds me of, there's something that people used to say about one of the organizations I used to work at. And I won't say their name to save them face, I guess. But one of the things we used to say internally is like, we're always in a race to be third.
Yeah.
Like nobody wants to be first. Few people want to be second. Everybody wants to be third. Once it's been proven out, once the standards are in place, once it's very well understood across all of those organizations at the same time, exactly how you do this stuff.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that what you're going to find is you're going to find that groups that are good at innovation, but also good at governance and understand how to put those things together are actually going to do better first. I think one of the things you're going to see, and this is counterintuitive, you're going to see these AI agents be deployed and be deployed in production at large enterprises in regulated industries first. And the reason is because those groups already have built up as part of their core competency how to do governance and compliance well, because they had to.
Oh,
They are
that's
under
interesting.
regulatory scrutiny to do so. And so they already have a lot of that connective tissue in place to manage large processes and measure outcomes and be able to produce evidence. having that as part of your DNA makes this sort of jump into a new technology easier. Because at the end of the day, yes, it's a cool tool and it can do a lot of things. It's very flexible, very powerful, but it's still a tool to accomplish a goal at the end of the day. And it's the same goals that you had last year and the year before. You're using a new tool to do it, and there's different ways of measuring that tool. But at the end of the day, you're still trying to accomplish the same goals. It's a business goal. And so I think you're going to see those organizations do a better job because they understand how to think that way. Other organizations will come on later as those standards do start to materialize out of NIST or out of the ISO organizations. So that there is, okay, not only can I tell you, hey, there's a generic framework, but here are the specific metrics you should do for the different types of use cases. That will come in the next few years. But the companies that already have that as part of their core competency to govern and manage these kinds of processes are the ones that can get there first.
Yeah. Yeah. It also really underscores your 500% versus 10% improvement, because if they can see multiples and they can understand the risk, then they can sort of isolate it, and they can put in that concept of, we're willing to attempt this, we're willing to go down this road because we know exactly what it's going to touch in the organization. But I mean, at least my experience of the large enterprise is that I agree that that tissue existed, but it wasn't touching everything. It was still relatively isolated. So, I mean, you believe it's going to touch everywhere? You think everyone's going to get attached to it? How's that gatekeeping going to work?
I think it's going to have to happen. I mean, for better or worse, and in my opinion, better. For better or worse, AI agentic workflows are not going away. They're only going to proliferate. They're so powerful and so flexible that you're going to start to see use cases for them pop up in every part of the organization. So if you don't start doing it, you're going to start quickly being left behind. And so I think that there is, besides the 500% increase in revenue or whatever the metric is, that's a good reason for an organization to invest in this kind of governance and invest in this kind of tracking to make sure that not only can they deploy AI, but they can do it responsibly and in a repeatable, consistent way. But all of those decisions are always a trade-off, right? And so if the reward is big enough, they're willing to take that risk, and they're willing to build the sort of infrastructure, both from a technology and tracking perspective, but also just an institutional perspective, to support that framework. Because it's only going to become more embedded in your businesses over time. It's not going away.
Well,
and so I think those that do it sooner and those that have a leg up because they already have a lot of that infrastructure are going to get there faster. But everybody's going to have to go there eventually.
so what does it look like when it's working well? Like, what are the positive attributes? Because governance is one of those difficult items that can often, frankly, slow an organization down, get off the rails, become over involved in areas that they are not really needed in. And especially when we're in this transition moment, I do think we're in a transition moment. We're learning about these new tools. We're learning how to apply them. They're changing on a regular basis. I mean, can you imagine if you had built a rigid system based on the end of 2023, you would not understand how to even think about agents as they are today. So what do you see as sort of the key attributes that people need to be leaning into to actually move towards a healthy governance model for this?
I think that you need a combination of a couple of different things. You need a way to track outcomes that are coming out of these systems. You need a way to measure whether or not you're getting into dangerous areas based on your use case. So as an example, we're a communications platform. We enable direct communications with end customers. Okay. So some key questions. How often is what's the hallucination rate? What's the rate at which it's making the wrong decision? So like a confusion matrix, good decision, bad decision, good outcome, bad outcome, and then looking at how often it's falling into each of those groups, and then finding a way to tune and manage it going forward. So I think it comes down to tracking, management, feedback. Minimally, you need those three things within any system just to make sure that it's going well. I think to back quality assurance stays. You need to be able to track the outcome and measure it against the benchmark. And then if it's outside that benchmark, you need to retune, provide feedback to the system. I think minimally that's what you need. Any system that works well is going to have at least those three components minimally. There's going to be a lot of nuances depending on your use case. There's going to be differences in terms of the standards that exist inside certain industries, but minimally you need those three parts.
I'm very hopeful to see that appear. I'm a large fan of OKRs, objectives and key results.
Mm-hmm.
However, and I've had the opportunity to help put it in place in numerous organizations, and it's very painful every single time. No matter how metric oriented the organization thinks it is,
Yeah.
sitting down and actually articulating objectives and linking those to outcomes at every level in every department is difficult. And I don't think as many organizations know. And I agree with you to set up governance, to set up the kind of positive feedback loop that we need to see to understand whether or not an agent actually had the outcome that we expected will require us to be thoughtful about what it is our businesses are supposed to do. How are they supposed to operate, not just how they are operating historically. I think a lot of organizations have not gone through that exercise in any time recently. And it's going to be difficult.
I think you're right. And I think it will be difficult for a lot of them. I think one of the things, though, that provides me some hope, I guess, that this may not be as long and as painful as it might have been before. Because there are certain industries, and I'm thinking specifically about like banking, financial services, and insurance, that I would say went through the data-driven transformation in the late 90s, early 2000s, where all of their decisions were really being driven by data and data science and processes that they could build and manage. Because they went through that, the 90s and early 2000s were really painful for a lot of governance organizations too. But as we move into this era, yes, the tools are different. But again, the goals that they're aiming at are kind of the same. Mm-hmm. It's just a different tool. So some of that same type of discipline and some of that same type of structure already exists at large organizations that made that data-driven transformation earlier, 20, 30 years ago. And so I think that if you went back 40 years, there would be nothing. It would be painful everywhere, across every industry. I think there are certain industries, particularly those that were under a lot of regulatory scrutiny and were making decisions that affect people in real ways about their finances, about their healthcare, that there was a microscope placed on them that required them to move towards repeatable, but also explainable and defensible ways for making decisions based on data. And this is an extension of that. I think those companies are going to be well suited. You'll have less of a fight, not none, but less of a fight to transition into this kind of governance model for agents than you would at, say, I don't know, an e-tailer, right? Where they weren't necessarily as disciplined about the way they manage their models.
Well, I hope you're right. I mean, I'm a little concerned that that's an outer shell, but what's in the center is still quite squishy. But I agree with you, at least that there are these hooks to attach to. As you look forward, what's the mindset you think people need to embrace so they can actually drive this forward in their enterprise and their environments?
I think that there are several things that come to mind immediately. The first thing is the way that these systems and models get viewed. I think it's incorrect and in some ways doing a disservice to what these models are attempting to do to expect them to be static in the way that some of the models we built in the past are. It's more appropriate to think of them as an individual doing a job, right? So the reason I bring this up is one of the issues that we've had is when you go to compliance groups and you start talking about how to measure accuracy of the model and what the benchmarks are. When you're talking about dealing with humans, like one-on-one conversations with end clients, you don't compare what the AI produces to a static template.
Yeah.
Static template is the same every time for every person. You can't compare it that way. What you have to do is you have to compare it to the other place in your organization where you have one-on-one communications with clients. And that generally happens in call centers. Customer service reps do it all day, every day. The greatest customer service organizations in the entire world do not have 100% compliance.
Right.
They're in
Of course
the
not.
low 90s. They're like 92, 93. That's like world class. And so if you're thinking about how you measure and manage agents that are doing that sort of interaction, your benchmark is humans. How well do the best humans do? Well trained, smart humans that had their full cup of coffee this morning and aren't tired. How do they behave? And generally speaking, the AI agents can beat that benchmark. And so there's a little bit of a mindset shift in the way that you evaluate these things and what benchmarks you even set up for them. Because comparing it to, hey, was it right 100% of the time? It may not need to be, particularly if when it's wrong for things that aren't terribly
Important.
risky,
Yeah.
right? Which is usually the case. But if people are compliant 92% of the time and the AI agent system is compliant 99.4% of the time, you're still much better off. And so I think that there is a mindset shift that has to happen. It's not, this is just, a lever that you pull and you get the same widget every time you pull the lever. It's going to be different and it's going to adapt and it's going to change over time. And it's more like comparing it to the guy who's pulling the lever than the lever itself.
Yeah, that resonates. It also occurs to me that people tend to sit on the two ends of the spectrum. They either think about agents as though they are literally intelligent people that go off and do their thing in sort of self-directed, or they go to the other side where they think of them as these fixed tools. And we see this because often for folks who are not building, who are not in the center of what we do, we get asked questions about, oh, well, how often do you need to run simulations? We're like, well, you're constantly changing your agents, you're constantly changing the models, so you need to constantly run your simulations. But that notion of there's this constant movement needs to be incorporated. And to your point, even the 99, it can go to 98, 97, back up to 99, down to 98. Like it's going to move around and people just have to start to embrace it. Like these aren't one and done. You need to put them there, constantly measure, constantly review, just like you would any other sort of, I'll put in quotes, living system.
Yeah.
It's
important. It's important to make sure that you understand that what you're doing is putting in place a certain level of intelligence into your system, and that requires change. It can't be the same every time because it's going to change depending on the feedback it's getting. It's going to be changing depending on the interactions it's having, and you want that. Otherwise, what you're doing is the same thing that we've been doing for the last 25 years. It's no different.
Yeah, the whole point here is move forward, do something different. Korash, thank you so much today. Great conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt.